Hey, how's it going? And today I just wanted to go over implicit and explicit type arguments in the verse code. And this is strictly in the verse code. There's no devices or anything like this. And this is straight out of the documentation we're kind of working through. And I wanted to do this because I didn't feel like implicit or explicit were clearly defined. If you go into the documentation, though, you will find this section here that talks about parametric types. And I've already done a tutorial about this, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But we get into this type called type. And that in itself is confusing because you have a data type that's called type. And then you have other things that are called type macros. So there's plenty of room for confusion. But right at the very beginning of the section on parametric types, it talks about explicit type arguments and implicit type arguments. And I didn't really see where these are clearly defined here. And so I'm just kind of working through these examples and putting them into my own words. So let's take a look at the code here. Since I couldn't find a definition anywhere in the documentation, I went to other places online and I found this one article on Reddit actually. And this gentleman here, Donald Shimoda, talks here. I think this is really relevant to verse because he talks about static type systems, dynamic type systems, and we know that verse, of course, is a static type system. He says now we can think about, let me close this, we can think about explicit and implicit type systems in the context of a static type system. And then he says that's where it really only makes sense. So here he defines a explicit type system that requires the programmer to manually write out all the types for each variable declared. The type system does not perform inference. It only relies on explicit annotations given by the programmer. Then he talks about implicit type systems that can perform some type of inference to deduce the types of terms without the user needing to explicitly label them. So this is the closest thing that I can find to a definition of what explicit and implicit types are. And I think it applies to verse because he references Haskell down here, which is a functional paradigm just like verse. So I'm pretty sure this is pretty close to what the definition is if there were one. So let's jump back in the code here. So that's where I'm getting this from. How I interpret it is implicit means the program can infer data types without them being explicitly defined. So that actually makes sense to me. Explicit means spelled out or the data types need to be specified. So I think this is a fair definition. Now, specifically in verse, implicit type arguments will accept any data type. And from all my experimentation and everything that I've done in verse, I've found this to be true. This is true. Also in verse, explicit type arguments / parameters have restrictions and known limitations. So in other words, they won't necessarily accept any data type. Let's walk through this. And this does relate to the type called type. We're going to get to that in a minute. So just know that explicit type arguments, they need to be specified and they have restrictions and known limitations in verse. So here we go. So up here I've actually created a type called myType, and then I've also created an array just to show you that an array can go through. And so here are our examples here. Okay, so we create a function here, and this is an implicit type argument, and it uses this where keyword here. So this is an example of an implicit type argument. And this with this specified as implicit, this will accept any data type in when it's called, and it will have no issues returning it. So this is where all the functionality is, where you see this implicit type argument. This is the one that allows you to create generic functions that have a wide range of application. Like you can use this to create maps and arrays and all different kinds of things, because you can write this one function and it'll take in any data type. And when I say any data type, I mean any data type. In this case, we're sending it an array. So we can send it arrays, container types, composite types, and common types. We can send this literally any data type. here. And so in this case, type really is referring to any data type that there is in verse when you're using the implicit. I have this in here just to show you that if we call return item with an array, that there's no errors. So we're going to get simply back our array that we sent. So we're going to send an array and we're going to get back an array. Now if we were to send a string or a float value, these would be considered explicit arguments. And that makes sense because they are spelled out. It's exactly a float and that's exactly a string. So here these are considered explicit arguments. This is out of the documentation. We have point 2. And now this is an explicit type argument, but this will only accept common data types like float, int, string, logic, message, rational, etc. And it will also accept the data type that's called type, this right here. And this is the only instance that I've seen where I've not gotten an error putting a T there. Any other container type will not work. Like if we tried to put a T in there with an array, that's not going to work. Nothing's going to work. For some reason, we can only put a T there with an option, but not with any other container type. And I'm not sure why that is, but that could be, again, a known limitation. So here we can send in, like I can send it an int. See that right there? I can send it an int. And even though it's a type and you think I could send anything I want in, watch what happens if I put my int array in here. Or just let me put in a float value. See, I'm going to get an error saying it's incompatible. So it won't accept just anything in. It'll only accept a common type in. So like if I type in a float, it'll take that. If I type in a string, it'll take that. But it won't take an array. So if I type in my int array, it won't take that either. So you see what I mean about the restrictions and limitations? Even though this is a generic type here, it won't just take anything in. So I found that very interesting. And so I write that off as a known limitation of the explicit type argument in verse. That's when we use this type spelled out like this. Now if we use it spelled out with the where, it will accept anything. Here it won't just accept anything, and we're going to get all kinds of restrictions. Now point 3 with regard to this explicit type argument is here we have another explicit type argument, and we're being there's no where word in here. We're just making T the identifier for the type. But again, this won't just take in anything, right? So what I found is that this will only accept a common type in, and it will work as long as the return is void or anything but T, this item here. Here I'm calling it with a type, and I can call it with an integer here. Just like above, I can call it with everything. I can't call it with the float, my int array. See, it won't take that either. So it's the same if I were just to put the T, and that's in point 4 here. Let me go ahead and just put an int in here. Oops. If we come down here to the type test, the very last one, this is the exact same structure as this, right? But now we're getting an error. And if you read the error message, it doesn't even really make sense because it says this function returns, this function returns a value of type T, but the function's body result is an incompatible value of type T. Well, clearly that doesn't even make sense, right? Because that is what is coming in. That is the same as a return value, right? So there's all kinds of problems when we put this here. The return type matches this. And I just write that out as a known limitation of the explicit type argument. So the bottom line for a lot of this is that you probably wouldn't be doing this very much, this explicit type argument, maybe within a class, but what you'd more likely be using is the implicit type argument. because that's the one that allows you to write a generic function that can take any data type in and put that same data type out. So that takes us all the way back to our definitions here, where implicit means the program can infer data types without them being explicitly defined. Explicit means spelled out, or the data types need to be specified. So anyway, I hope you found this of some help. Take care, have a great day, and I will post an update to this as this develops and evolves and changes. So take care, and I'll talk to you next time.